And amidst the continuing worsening of relations between India and Canada, one astonishing aspect of the story, viewer, has been completely missed. I wonder why. In the middle of an increasingly aggressive war of claims and counterclaims, one aspect has for some reason been ignored completely, even by the media, until now. Because honestly, viewer, India can sit here forever and point a finger at Canada, but the truth I'm about to tell you could and should change everything. So pay very close attention to what I'm about to tell you. The terrorist bombing of Kanishka Air India Flight 182 on June the 23rd, 1985 remains one of the deadliest terrorist attacks in aviation history. The plane en route from Montreal in Canada to Delhi, India, exploded midair off the coast of Ireland, killing all 329 passengers and crew members, including 268 Canadian citizens. Two major investigations in Canada indicted ISI-backed pro-Khalistan Canadian terrorists, Canadian citizens, as the masterminds behind this bombing. But what Canada doesn't want you to know is that Canadian intelligence itself was involved in this conspiracy. I bet you didn't know that. You don't have to believe me either, because obviously I'm guilty of foreign interference as per a new government report. But you would believe documents released by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, wouldn't you? The country's public broadcaster, CBC, reported in May 2003 that Canadian Security and Intelligence Service, or CSIS, had an agent in the plot to bomb the Kanishka Air India flight, and that it pulled out this agent at the last minute so he wouldn't be implicated. His name was Surjan Singh Gill, who was, according to official Canadian documents, reported by Canada's public broadcaster in 2003, not my opinion, Canada's opinion. He was pulled out at the last minute because his Canadian intelligence handlers felt that things are happening and you can't be seen as part of that. Surjan Singh Gill was pulled out days before the Kanishka Air India bombing. Surjan Singh Gill was smuggled out of Canada to the UK, where he promptly disappeared, never to be seen again. Nobody knows where he is or even if he's alive. In other words, Canadian intelligence, an arm of the Canadian government, were aware of the Kanishka bombing plot, but either chose not to stop it or simply got out of the way so it could proceed. What the Canadian police documents, the RCMP documents, basically say, therefore, is that the Canadian government made a covert decision to protect a sensitive source at the cost of 329 lives, including 268 Canadian citizens who lost their lives in that Kanishka bombing. The same CBC public broadcaster report that reveals the RCMP documents nailing Canadian intelligence in the Kanishka plot also say that the Canadian Intelligence Agency destroyed hundreds of wiretaps relating to the Air India investigation subsequently, something that the Crown conceded in court was unacceptable negligence. Negligence? Is this negligence that an intelligence agency of Canada, nailed by its own government to have been embedded in the Kanishka bombing plot, could destroy huge amounts of specific evidence owing to negligence? Wasn't it rather just the opposite of negligence, viewer? A very specific and deliberate destruction of evidence in order to shield the Canadian state's direct involvement in one of the world's worst terrorist attacks. But the destruction of that evidence had set the ball rolling towards what would become a few years later a national campaign to let the Canadian government and Canadian intelligence off the hook and whitewash Canadian government involvement with pro-Khalistani terrorists in the Kanishka bombing plot. In 2010, the John C. Major Investigative Committee shockingly concluded that it was a, and I quote, cascading series of errors by Crown ministries, the RCMP, and the Canadian intelligence that allowed the terrorist attack to take place. In other words, not commission, but omission. Not deliberate action, but negligence. Not pulling the trigger, but sleeping at the wheel. Not you did a bad thing, but you weren't doing your job to stop that bad thing. That is how poisoned Canadian politics and state morality in Canada is by pro-Khalistan terrorists. And if you think that was bad, try this on for size, viewer. Ever since Justin Trudeau declared a diplomatic war on India over the killing of terrorist Hardeep Singh Nijjar last year, pro-Khalistan elements in Trudeau's Liberal Party have been emboldened enough by this national platform to actually call for a revisiting of the Kanishka bombing case. Can you believe that? A case in which two separate Canadian investigations have managed to indict Canadian pro-Khalistan terrorists and groups. In August this year, Trudeau's party colleague, a shameless man called Sukh Dhaliwal, that's him on your screen, sponsored a petition calling for a new investigation into the Kanishka Air India bombing. It takes no great intelligence to see that this is a brazen, bloodless attempt to shift the blame away from pro-Khalistani terrorists and somehow blame someone else, presumably the Indian government or RAW or the Indian Intelligence Bureau, for bombing Air India Kanishka. As Canadian politicians balk at how the Indian media has been covering this story and how Trudeau's government has shamefully attempted to label Indian journalism as foreign interference, the Canadian public should know that this is what Justin Trudeau's legacy really is. Canadian civil society and Canadian media have been helpless in the face of the rampant infestation of the country's political and intelligence system by terrorists and gangsters owing allegiance to a fantasy cause kept alive by Pakistan in order to maintain security leverage against India. The Canadian public ought to know that the Canadian government has allowed Canada's global reputation to be sullied, possibly irrevocably, by surrendering its institutions and the levers of power to gun runners, drug traffickers, and murderers, most of whom are wanted with requests for extradition from the world's largest democracy. The blood of 329 victims, including 268 Canadian citizens, would boil if it knew that 4 decades later, the Trudeau government that had sworn to protect citizens is waging a war to protect those that spilt that very same blood. Because this is now the unshakable truth, viewer. By making the appeasement of terrorists state policy and in fact state structure, the Canadian state can no longer be seen as separate from these terrorists on its soil.